Welcome to Pharma Pro Podcast.
I've heard of that one.
It's
pretty popular.
they've got this motto: listen to learn, apply to grow, master to lead.
Catchy.
That's right. Today's topic is nitrosamine impurities. Welcome to the deep dive, where today we'll be venturing into a realm that's often overlooked but incredibly important: drug safety, specifically the issue of nitrosamine impurities. Now, I know that might sound a little intimidating, but don't worry, we're going to break it all down for you using some really fascinating FDA guidelines, expert analyses, and even a helpful study guide. Think of it as detective work, where we'll carefully analyze these sources and try to really understand these unwanted chemical compounds that sometimes find their way into our medications.
The complexities of this issue come from the need to balance drug safety with the need to ensure that people have access to the vital medications that they need.
So, to start unraveling this mystery, let's first define what nitrosamines are and why their presence in our medications is such a concern.
Nitrosamines are chemical compounds, some of which are known to be probable or possible human carcinogens. It's important to note, though, that not all nitrosamines are harmful.
So not all bad guys in the bunch. I'm curious how these compounds, the ones that are harmful, how do they end up contaminating the drugs in the first place?
Well, one of the contamination points is during the manufacturing of the active pharmaceutical ingredient, the API. That's the heart of any drug. But even if that API is initially pristine, contamination can creep in later down the line, during manufacturing, for instance.
So these unwanted guests can kind of sneak in at different stages.
They can. For example, excipients, the inactive ingredients that give a drug its form, color, and stability, they can be a source of these impurities.
Excipients, they're often overlooked, but as you're pointing out, they can have a big impact on the quality and safety of that final drug. Are there other ways that contamination can occur?
Contamination isn't limited to just excipients, unfortunately. Even the water that's used during manufacturing or even the packaging materials themselves can introduce these unwanted compounds.
It sounds like maintaining a completely contaminant-free environment throughout the whole process. That must be incredibly challenging.
It is a monumental challenge.
So given these numerous points where contamination can occur, how does the FDA approach this issue? How do they work to try to manage these risks?
Well, the FDA has put in place a really comprehensive three-step plan to mitigate those risks. The first step is risk assessment, which requires manufacturers to examine meticulously every stage of their production process to try and identify potential points where nitrosamine contamination might occur.
It makes sense to first figure out where the vulnerabilities are before taking any other action. So what happens once those potential contamination points have been identified?
That leads to the second step, confirmatory testing. If red flags are raised during that initial risk assessment, manufacturers are required to conduct highly sensitive tests to detect even tiny traces of nitrosamines.
It seems like that level of testing is essential to ensure the integrity of our medications. What happens if those tests do reveal unacceptable levels of nitrosamines?
Well, in that case, the third step kicks in: reporting and transparency. Manufacturers are required to take action immediately to reduce or eliminate those nitrosamines to an acceptable level. And they have to keep the FDA informed throughout this process. Transparency and accountability are paramount. Now, the FDA also plays a crucial role by establishing acceptable intake limits, or AALs, for specific nitrosamines. AALs represent the maximum daily intake of a particular nitrosamine that's considered to pose a negligible cancer risk over a lifetime.
So that's that safety threshold. Determining these ALs must be pretty complex. Earlier, you mentioned that there are different types of nitrosamines. Does this influence how these safety thresholds are established?
It does. The variation among nitrosamines is a significant factor when we're establishing ALs. One particular type, nitrosamine drug substance-related impurities, NDSRIs for short, they present a unique challenge. They're structurally very similar to the active ingredient in each drug. NDSRIs often lack the extensive research data that we have for what we call small molecule nitrosamines, and this makes establishing those ALs more challenging.
So it's like every drug has its own unique, mischievous twin lurking within its structure.
That's a great way to put it. So to address this, the FDA utilizes what we call a predicted carcinogenic potency categorization approach for NDSRIs. Essentially, they use what we know about similar compounds to kind of estimate the risk.
So it's a molecular level investigation to determine those safety thresholds. It's not just about setting limits, though. What strategies can be employed to minimize nitrosamine formation in the first place?
Well, one important strategy is controlling the excipients used in the drug formulations. Manufacturers are strongly encouraged to screen their excipients for the presence of nitrites, which can contribute to nitrosamine formation. They really have to know their suppliers and have confidence in the suppliers' processes.
Having that trust and that strong relationship with your suppliers seems critical to ensuring drug safety. What happens if an excipient is flagged as a potential problem?
Well, in some cases, manufacturers might be able to switch to an alternative excipient, one that has a lower or non-existent nitrate content. But that's not always a simple solution. Changing excipients can affect how the drug performs, how it dissolves, its overall stability.
It sounds like there's a constant weighing of the potential benefits against the potential risks in this process. Are there other strategies that are used to try to minimize nitrosamine formation during drug manufacturing?
Another approach focuses on the manufacturing process of the active pharmaceutical ingredient itself. The FDA provides detailed guidance to manufacturers on how to optimize reaction conditions during the synthesis of the API. They have to carefully control things like temperature, pH, and even the specific order in which ingredients are added.
It sounds like meticulously perfecting a recipe to avoid any unwanted reactions.
That's a great analogy.
So are there any other strategies that are being explored to address this issue?
One really interesting approach involves adding antioxidants to the drug formulation. Antioxidants can act as tiny bodyguards within the drug, protecting it from those harmful reactions that can lead to nitrosamine formation.
Antioxidants are usually something we associate with good health, so it's fascinating to learn that they play a role in medications as well.
It is, and research has actually shown that incorporating something as simple as vitamin C into a drug formulation can significantly reduce nitrosamine formation.
So even a seemingly simple addition can have a big impact on drug safety. It really highlights how much science and strategy goes into ensuring the safety of the medications that we often take without a second thought.
It does. It's a multi-pronged approach. You've got to control your ingredients, optimize the manufacturing process, and even tweak the final formulation.
Now, I'm wondering, what happens during those periods when manufacturing processes are being changed or drugs are being reformulated? Are there interim measures in place to make sure people still have access to the medication they need, especially if there's a risk of drug shortages?
The FDA recognizes the possibility of drug shortages, and they aim to balance patient safety with the need to maintain access to essential medications. In specific cases, they might allow a drug to remain on the market temporarily, even if its nitrosamine levels are slightly above the ideal limit. This is only for a limited time, though, and only under very carefully controlled circumstances. These temporary thresholds are called interim ALs. They provide a short reprieve while the manufacturer is working to find a permanent solution.
It sounds like a calculated risk to prevent a potentially even bigger problem. How is transparency maintained in situations like that?
The FDA is very committed to transparency, and they plan to publish any recommended interim ALs on their website. This keeps healthcare providers and the public informed.
So it's reassuring to know that the FDA is committed to striking that balance between maintaining access to those essential medications, but also ensuring patient safety.
Absolutely. And that commitment also extends to actively exploring ways to reduce reliance on animal testing, particularly when reformulating drugs to address nitrosamine concerns.
Reducing reliance on animal testing is definitely a positive thing. Can you elaborate a bit on what the FDA is doing in that area?
For some reformulations, for example, those involving the addition of certain antioxidants, the FDA might allow manufacturers to avoid those costly and time-consuming in vivo bioequivalence studies that often involve animal testing.
So under what conditions would the FDA actually waive those animal tests?
Well, it's not a blanket exemption, but there are specific circumstances where it might be possible. For example, for immediate release, solid oral or oral suspension drug products, where the API meets certain criteria and the antioxidant is added in a small amount, the FDA might permit manufacturers to demonstrate bioequivalence using comparative dissolution testing instead. And this would eliminate the need for animal testing in those specific cases.
That does sound like a positive step towards reducing the need for animal testing. I'm curious, does the FDA simply issue guidelines and hope for the best? Or are there established deadlines for manufacturers to address these nitrosamine concerns?
They do take a very proactive approach. They've set clear deadlines for manufacturers to complete those risk assessments and confirmatory tests for both small molecule nitrosamines and NDSRIs.
It's good to know that they are holding manufacturers accountable. Does their involvement end there?
No, their role extends beyond setting deadlines. The FDA emphasizes that managing nitrosamine risks is an ongoing process, especially with new information about nitrosamines constantly emerging. Continued vigilance and proactive risk management are crucial. This isn't a one-time fix.
It's very much an evolving situation, isn't it? It's really enlightening to gain this insight into this world of drug safety, to understand the efforts involved in minimizing the risks posed by nitrosamines.
It really highlights how complex this web is. This web of science, regulation, and manufacturing that's involved in something as simple as taking a pill.
Out of everything we've discussed so far, what stands out to you as the most important takeaway? Would it be the multitude of potential contamination points, the intricate testing involved, or perhaps that balancing act that the FDA has to perform to ensure drug safety while maintaining access to these vital medications?
For me, it's the FDA's commitment to transparency. Their dedication to keeping the public informed, even in those complex situations where a drug might contain nitrosamine levels exceeding that ideal limit, it really shows their dedication to patient safety.
Their commitment to transparency is definitely reassuring. As we continue to explore this topic, I'm wondering, is it possible to incorporate these preventative measures into drug development itself, to minimize those nitrosamine risks from the very beginning?
That's a really interesting question, and it's a question that's at the forefront of current research. Imagine a future where those nitrosamine risks are minimized or even eliminated entirely during the earliest stages of drug design.
That would be a game changer for drug safety. But for now, it sounds like we're in pretty capable hands with the FDA's very meticulous approach to identifying, assessing, and mitigating these risks.
The FDA is taking a very proactive stance, aiming to get ahead of this issue rather than simply reacting to problems as they arise.
It sounds like preventative medicine applied to drug development itself. What does that proactive approach look like in practice?
It starts with awareness and early detection. The FDA encourages manufacturers to consider the potential for nitrosamine formation from the very beginning of the drug development process, even before large-scale clinical trials begin. They're really baking safety into the process from day one.
So preventing a problem before it has a chance to actually occur. Does this involve ongoing communication between the manufacturers and the FDA?
It's a collaborative process. There's ongoing communication. If a manufacturer identifies a potential nitrosamine risk during those early stages of development, they share that information with the FDA as part of their application process.
So there's communication happening right from the start. It's not just a one-time approval and then everyone moves on.
It's an ongoing dialogue. It extends throughout the drug's life cycle. If a manufacturer needs to make changes to the manufacturing process or reformulate their product, they have to keep the FDA informed every step of the way.
It sounds like there's a lot of back and forth between manufacturers and the FDA.
There is, and the FDA provides very specific guidance on what needs to be reported and how. There are different regulations for different changes in applications, but their goal isn't to overwhelm manufacturers with rules. It's really to guide them through those regulations, help them understand the process.
It's a very complex process, but very necessary to ensure the safety of our medication.
Absolutely.
So often that involves reformulating drugs to reduce those nitrosamine levels. And that's something we touched upon earlier in our conversation. Can you remind me what that reformulation process entails?
The specifics of how a drug gets reformulated, it really depends on the drug and the specific nitrosamine that's involved. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. However, those antioxidant heroes that we discussed earlier, they often play a significant role here. Adding antioxidants to a drug's formulation can be surprisingly effective in preventing nitrosamine formation.
Antioxidants are getting a lot of attention these days.
They are. Think of them as those tiny but powerful warriors, intercepting those troublesome nitrosamines before they can cause harm. And incorporating antioxidants into a drug formulation is often a relatively simple change that can make a big difference in safety.
It's like adding that crucial ingredient to a recipe that prevents it from going wrong.
Exactly. Another strategy involves adjusting the pH of the drug formulation, making it less acidic, so that it creates an environment that's less conducive to nitrosamine formation. It all comes down to understanding the underlying chemistry and using that knowledge to improve the safety of our medicines.
It is remarkable how even those seemingly small adjustments can have such a big impact on drug safety. But with all these changes being made, how do we know those reformulated drugs are still going to be effective in treating the conditions they were designed to address?
That's something the FDA takes very seriously. They have strict requirements for what we call bioequivalence, which means that the reformulated drug must be equivalent to the original drug in how it's absorbed and how it behaves within the body. It's not just about eliminating nitrosamines, it's also about making sure the medicine still works the way it should.
So there's rigorous testing involved to prove that continued efficacy.
Absolutely. And that's why bioequivalence studies are conducted. These studies compare the reformulated drug to the original version using human volunteers. They're given both versions of the drug, and then scientists observe how their bodies react to make sure that the reformulated version is performing as expected.
It sounds like a pretty involved process.
It can be a lengthy and expensive process, but it is crucial for ensuring that those reformulated drugs are both safe and effective. Now, the FDA is actively seeking ways to streamline this process whenever possible to make it easier for manufacturers to reformulate their products without compromising on that safety or effectiveness.
Are there any situations where these bioequivalence studies might not be necessary?
The FDA has identified a few specific cases where they might be able to waive those studies, particularly when we're dealing with certain types of drugs and specific reformulations.
Can you give some examples of these situations?
Sure, if you have an immediate release solid oral drug or an oral suspension, and the only change that's being made is the addition of a very small amount of a specific antioxidant, the FDA might determine that this minor change is unlikely to impact how that drug works in the body.
So they're using their scientific expertise to make that judgment.
Exactly.